Hi, I'm Gregg LeFevre, and this is The Compulsive Storyteller, a series of short personal stories where we explore the idea that truth can be stranger than fiction. This week's story is entitled Summertime. Summertime, and the livin' is easy. Fish are jumpin', and the cotton is high. So wrote George Gershwin. In the snowbelt of upstate New York, summer was a relief after the brutal winter. It was a time of easy living, and even though there was no cotton, the fish were jumping. Starting when I was in grade school, my dad took me fishing. We fished together in small streams, ponds, lakes, rivers, and the Atlantic Ocean. Brook trout were what we fished for in the streams outside of Utica, New York. Oriskany Creek was one of our favorites. It's amazing, though, that we kept at it since we rarely came home with anything in our creels. There's a great quote by Paul O'Neill that perfectly captures our predicament. There he stands, draped in more equipment than a telephone lineman, trying to outwit an organism with a brain no larger than a breadcrumb and getting licked in the process. After one of our many unsuccessful such expeditions, we passed a roadside farm business called the Adirondack Trout Ranch, where there was a large pond stocked with big, fat, farm-fed rainbow trout. It was so exciting catching one big trout after another that we overdid it. When we finished and went to the weigh-in shack, it set my father back $35, which was a small fortune in those days. His message to me when we got the bad news: do not mention this to your mother. When we arrived home, we scaled and filleted the fish and put them in our freezer. We left for Cape Cod a few days later, and when we returned from our vacation, there was an overwhelmingly awful smell throughout the house. The refrigerator had conked out in our absence, and all of our delicious fillets had rotted in the freezer. My mother was not at all amused, but if she'd known what we paid for the fish, she would have hit the ceiling. It took weeks for the smell of fish in the house to completely dissipate. On Oneida Lake, we fished for bass, but mostly caught sunfish and carp. We were both perplexed that our neighbor, who had a cabin on the shore of the lake next to the cabin we rented for the summer, seemed to have incredibly good luck catching fish. We'd see him come home time and time again with a half a dozen fish on his stringer. Then we learned from another neighbor that they were stuffed fish, that he'd secreted onto the boat when he headed out to fish and proudly showed off upon his return. In the St. Lawrence River, we fished for pike and largemouth bass. We did have some spectacular luck every so often. One weekend, my dad caught a 30-inch long great northern pike. I walked around the road that wound through the campsite in the state park where we were staying. With the pike hanging down from a stringer I was proudly holding high. I had to stop regularly to rest my arm. At one point, an old man in a new Cadillac pulled up and offered me $10 for the fish. I said I'd have to ask my dad, who it turned out was all in for the idea of selling the fish, but when I returned looking for the guy in the Cadillac, he was nowhere to be found. We also did our fair share of deep-sea fishing. Check out my podcast, episode number 102, New Year's Eve Descent into Hell, for some hair-raising stories about deep-sea fishing gone horribly wrong. On a tall wooden archway that looked not unlike a gallows, on McMillan Wharf in Provincetown, Massachusetts, a 12-foot-long shark has been strung up by its beautifully shaped tail. My dad took one look at the fish and raced back to our car to retrieve my little kid's toy fishing rod and reel. Then he posed me next to the man-eater, a very proud, skinny little 4-foot-tall kid standing next to his catch, wearing his little white underpants as a bathing suit. I still have the photo. On Cape Cod, we fished for bluefish, mackerel, and stripers. Sometimes we'd run a boat, and sometimes we'd go out on a charter boat. If you had a pro take you out, your chances of catching something were much improved. Once we were fishing on a charter boat called the Four-Leaf Clover out of Chatham. The sea was calm, and the captain spotted a flock of seagulls diving into a spot on the surface of the sea that from a distance looked turbulent. There was a school of bonito feeding on anchovies just beneath the surface of the water, and as the little fish raced to escape their predators, they jumped out of the water, only to find themselves eaten by an aerial predator. Every time we trolled our lines through the rippling circle on the water, all 3 fishing poles got a strike at once. It was crazy having all the reels whizzing out line at the same time, and amidst the confusion, there were lots of laughs. By the time we called it quits, our arms ached from pulling in all the fighting fish. Another time, we were in a small rented boat on Cape Cod Bay, just offshore from Provincetown. I spotted a huge shark swimming on the surface of the water, heading straight toward us, with its dorsal fin cutting through the water and its nose creating a small bow wave. Without consulting my dad, I made what turned out to be a perfect cast and bounced a lure and sinker right off the behemoth's snout. The startled shark sounded, and as he did so, thrashed his broad tail, splashing us with a large wave that almost capsized our boat. In our minds, this was a story for the fishing history books. When we got back to the boat rental place, the guy behind the desk informed us that our run-in was with a blue shark, sometimes a man-eater, and definitely not a fish to be messed with. Once retired, my dad spent his winters in Florida, where he lived in a condo development in Vero Beach called Vista Gardens. He called Vero Beach Zero Beach because nothing ever happened there. The development had incredible tropical landscaping and was intertwined with an excellent golf course where there were some beautiful ponds that served as water traps. My father, being the fisherman that he was, often fished for bass in these ponds. One night he hooked a good-sized largemouth bass, and as he reeled it in, he realized that an alligator was closing in on his catch. Because he couldn't reel fast enough to beat the gator, he started to run across the grass fairway with his rod and reel in hand. When the bass was flipped onto the shore, the gator was undeterred and followed the fish out of the water as well. Gators, it turned out, are very fast for short spurts, and when my dad realized that he was up against a man-eater he couldn't outrun, he dropped his pole and continued to flee. The gator chomped down on his equipment and swallowed it whole, hook, line, and sinker, and then returned to the pond. Once back in upstate New York, my dad got a tip from one of his fishing buddies that there was a great place to fish on the Mohawk River. It was next to a farmer's pasture, but the area wasn't posted, so we could fish there. One sunny Saturday morning, we crossed over a barbed wire fence and headed across a wide field with some grazing Holsteins and Black Angus. We were both excited and filled with hope that this new spot would lead to our catching some fish. The river had a mild current, and I stood on its sandy, muddy edge, while my dad, wearing his rubber waders, moved out into the stream. We left our tackle boxes, our lunch, and some other equipment a little ways up the embankment toward the farmer's field. We weren't having any luck, but it was a lovely day. Alexander Pope's "Hope springs eternal in the human breast" can apply to the hopes of fishermen, as well as things more metaphysical. At that moment, I heard something behind us and turned to see at the top of the embankment, standing in a gap in the fence, a Black Angus bull pawing the dirt with his hooves and snorting in preparation for an attack. My father yelled for me to get into the water, and we both moved out up to our necks, then treaded water there. The bull came charging down the hill and into the water up to his knees, but then thought better of it. He was still enraged and bellowing, so he turned back from the water and proceeded to stomp on and crush all of our equipment, thrashing around our tackle boxes until they were emptied of all our hooks and lures. Next, he ripped apart our lunches and sampled our chicken salad sandwiches. My dad commented ironically, "Too bad they weren't roast beef." With that, he came to a halt, and we had a Mexican standoff of sorts. He stood and watched while we treaded water, tiring with every passing minute. We considered swimming to the far side, but the river was too wide at that point. Finally, the bull went back up the incline and disappeared into the pasture. We waited a bit and then came ashore, gathered up the rubble of our equipment that remained, and walked quickly down the edge of the river to head inland across the next field. It turns out that was the last fishing trip I ever took with my dad. What a great end to our long fishing careers together. Epilogue. There's an old Spanish proverb, "He who wants to catch a fish must not mind getting wet." If you enjoyed this week's episode, let us know. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook at The Compulsive Storyteller, and we'd love to hear from you. This podcast is independently produced, so we really appreciate all your help and support. Share the show with your friends, subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and please leave a review. You can also check out our website, thecompulsivestoryteller.com, for more information. Thanks for listening, and if you didn't like this one, the next one will be another story. The Compulsive Storyteller is now co-produced by Gregg LeFevre and Fadia Montserrat, who's also arranged the music and created the special effects. Emily Ramon does design, research, editing, and marketing. Peter Kokoma has made our theme music and for many seasons co-produced the show with me. All characters and events portrayed in this podcast are based on my truth, with some names and facts changed for privacy. The conversations and dialogues are based on my best memory, but are not word-for-word recreations.